All right, today we're tackling a big one, prejudice. But we're going to look at it a little differently, almost like we're architects. We're going to deconstruct it, look at the blueprints, the materials, and the structures that hold it all together. The goal? To really understand how it's built and why it's so persistent. You ready? Let's dive in.
So, let's kick things off with a question. When you think of prejudice, what comes to mind? For a lot of us, it's this idea of a personal opinion, right? Just one person's private belief about another group of people. Seems pretty straightforward, but is that really all there is to it?
Well, the short answer is a hard no. It's not just some personal quirk or a simple opinion. Prejudice is way more complicated than that. It's what we call a social construction. That means it's something that we, as a society, actually build, teach, and pass down.
Okay, so if it's not just a simple opinion, what is it then? To get to the bottom of that, we have to look beyond just one person's head and zoom out to see the bigger picture, the whole social fabric that surrounds us.
Here's a more formal definition. I want you to pay attention to a few key words here: learned, attitude, and generalizations. This is so important because it tells us that these attitudes, they aren't something we're born with. And they're usually not based on a ton of direct personal experience. They're adopted.
So, if these attitudes are learned, where do we pick them up? Well, kind of everywhere. They get woven into our culture, our education systems, the media we watch and read, and even our biggest social institutions. And that right there is why we have to see it as a social phenomenon, not just some individual psychological problem.
Now, to really get a handle on this, we can break prejudice down into 3 parts that are all linked together. You can think of this as the basic anatomy of prejudice.
So, we've got the cognitive dimension, that's what we think. Then there's the affective dimension, that's what we feel. And finally, the behavioral dimension, that's what we do. And here's the thing, they don't exist in a vacuum. They build on each other in a really powerful sequence. Let me show you what I mean.
You see, it all kicks off with that first dimension, the cognitive one. It all begins with a thought, a belief, that's often floating around in our heads without us even realizing it.
And that thought? That's a stereotype. You can think of stereotypes as these little mental shortcuts. I mean, they help our brains organize a super complex world into neat, tidy boxes. The problem is, they are, by their very nature, way too simple and totally rigid. They erase all the incredible diversity that makes people, well, people.
But if thought rarely just stays a thought, does it? That cognitive belief, that stereotype, almost always sparks an emotional response. And that brings us to the second dimension. This is where that simple thought gets its power. Just look at the kind of feelings that tend to glom onto stereotypes: fear, distrust, rejection, contempt. These are powerful emotions, and once they latch on to that initial belief, they make it feel so much more real, so much harder to question.
And this is the moment where prejudice breaks out of our internal world of thoughts and feelings and crashes into the real world. That 1-2 punch of a thought and a feeling paves the way for the final dimension, action. We call this discrimination. It's the tangible, real-world result of prejudice. It's what happens when those internal beliefs and emotions get turned into actions that actually exclude people, deny them opportunities, or cause them real harm. This is the point where an internal attitude creates a very real external consequence. Okay, so we've got a pretty good idea of what prejudice is and how it's built, piece by piece. But that leads to a bigger question. Why? Why does it even exist? What purpose could it possibly serve in a society?
Well, it turns out it serves 2 major social functions. First, like we talked about with stereotypes, it helps simplify a messy, complicated reality. But the second one is much more serious. It works to justify social inequality. It creates a story, a rationale, for why things are the way they are, making huge differences in power seem, well, natural, or maybe even unavoidable.
And this really gets to the core of it. Prejudice is fundamentally tangled up with power. It often becomes the tool that allows groups with more social power to define, label, and classify those with less, which helps keep that existing hierarchy in place. So now, let's zoom out. Because when you see how all these pieces fit together, you start to realize we're not just talking about individual attitudes anymore. We're talking about a system.
You see, when these dimensions, the thoughts, feelings, and actions, and these functions get baked into a society's laws, its institutions, its culture, prejudice levels up. It becomes a structured, systematic force, and the most powerful example of this is racism. Racism isn't just a bunch of prejudiced people. It's a whole social practice. It's a system that takes normal human differences, physical or cultural, and says, hey, these are fundamental and natural. And then it uses that logic to build and defend social hierarchies and organize inequality on a massive scale. You know, after looking at all of this, the structure, the functions, the massive systems, it can all feel pretty heavy, pretty overwhelming. Which brings us to the most important question of all. Can any of this actually be changed?
And the answer, thankfully, is yes. Because prejudice is something we build as a society, it's also something we can deconstruct. These attitudes are learned, and that means they can also be unlearned. They are not some permanent, unchangeable part of who we are.
So, where do we even begin? Well, a few key pathways have been shown to work. It starts with real, meaningful contact between different groups, which helps break down those invisible walls. It takes a lot of critical self-reflection. And, maybe most importantly, it means we have to consciously and actively question the stereotypes we've all inherited. And that brings us to the final thought I want to leave you with. The social architecture of prejudice was built over a long, long time, often without anyone noticing the blueprints. The first step to taking it apart is just to see it clearly, starting with ourselves. So, the question is, what ideas about other people have we just accepted as true, without ever stopping to ask why? Now that's a question worth thinking about.